Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight of centuries pressing down like autumn leaves, layer upon layer, until time itself becomes something you can touch. Tonight, we journey to a place where marble columns once caught the golden light of dawn, where the footsteps of emperors echoed through corridors of power, and where the greatest empire the world had ever known began its slow, inevitable dance with twilight. Rome, the Eternal City. A name that once made distant kings tremble and caused ships to change course on distant seas. But eternity, as we shall see, is not quite what mortals imagine it to be. Picture yourself standing on the 7 hills as the sun sets behind the Tiber, casting long shadows across a city that ruled from the misty shores of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. The air is thick with the scent of olive oil and incense, the distant murmur of a million souls living, loving, dreaming, beneath the protection of eagles carved in stone. This is our beginning, not at Rome's end, but at the moment when the first cracks began to show in the foundation of the world. But before we begin this journey through shadow and memory, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Then leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories from history's twilight hours you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Now dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away. Close your eyes and simply listen. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop. And allow yourself to drift backward through time to an age when the fate of civilization hung in the balance and the echoes of falling empires could be heard across the centuries like distant thunder. Tonight, we witness the slow, majestic collapse of Rome, not as historians might tell it with dates and battles, but as a story of human hearts beating in the darkness, of dreams crumbling like ancient parchment, and of the way all things, even the mightiest, must eventually return to dust. In the soft light of a Roman dawn, when dew still clung to the marble steps of the Forum, and the city stirred like a giant slowly waking, few could have imagined that the Golden Age was already becoming memory. The year was 180, and Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, the last of the great rulers, lay dying in a military tent along the Danube frontier, his weathered hands clutching scrolls of stoic wisdom that had guided him through plague and war. Listen. Can you hear it? The sound of rain on canvas, the distant neighing of horses, the whispered prayers of soldiers who knew their emperor was slipping away like water through cupped palms. This was not how empires were supposed to end, not in glory or conquest, but in a cold tent far from Rome with barbarian campfires glowing like fallen stars beyond the river. Marcus Aurelius had been Rome's conscience, a man who wrote by candlelight about duty and acceptance while the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders. "Remember that very little disturbs the peace of mind of one who is humble," he had written, ink flowing across parchment in the quiet hours before battle. But as his breathing grew shallow, as his son Commodus waited in the shadows to inherit an empire, peace of mind seemed as distant as the stars above. Commodus, barely 20, ascended to power with all the eagerness of youth and none of the wisdom of his father. Where Marcus had been a philosopher, Commodus was a performer, a man who believed the roar of the crowd in the Colosseum was worth more than the silent respect of senators. Picture him there in the arena's golden sand, fighting as a gladiator while wearing the purple of emperors, a sight that would have made his ancestors weep. The senators watched from their marble seats, their faces masks of forced approval, but their hearts filled with the cold knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer the Rome of Augustus or Trajan, where emperors were gods walking among mortals. This was something new, something desperate, a performance of power rather than power itself. In the streets below, the common people cheered their emperor's victories over wild beasts and trained fighters, but even their cheers carried an undertone of uncertainty. The bread was still distributed, the wine still flowed, but the barbarians were growing bolder beyond the frontiers, and the treasury, that vast storehouse of gold that had seemed inexhaustible, was beginning to show the strain of endless spectacles and military campaigns. Night fell over Rome like a curtain, and in the quiet darkness, the city seemed to hold its breath. In the wealthy villas on the Palatine Hill, oil lamps flickered as senators whispered of the emperor's madness. In the tenements of the Subura, families huddled together as the autumn wind rattled their shutters, and beyond the walls, beyond the reach of torchlight, the world waited with the patience of wolves. The Danube frontier, where Marcus Aurelius had died, remained restless. Germanic tribes moved like shadows through the forests, their warriors bearing scars from Roman steel, but carrying in their hearts the knowledge that the legions were not quite as invincible as they once had been. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, names that would soon echo through history like war drums, tested the walls and watchtowers, probing for weakness. But perhaps the greatest cracks were not in the stone fortifications along distant rivers, but in the hearts of Romans themselves. The old certainties were fading, like prayers whispered in an empty temple. The gods seemed more distant, the future more uncertain, and the past, that glorious past of conquest and triumph, felt like someone else's dream. In the imperial palace, slaves moved through corridors that had once rung with the laughter of Augustus, their footsteps muffled by centuries of accumulated silence. The marble faces of long-dead emperors stared down from their niches, their stone eyes holding secrets that the living could no longer read. And in the heart of it all, Commodus played his games, performed his roles, and slowly, without realizing it, began the long process of teaching the world that Rome was not eternal after all. The golden mask was beginning to crack, hairline fractures that caught the light strangely, making the familiar seem suddenly fragile. The dance of empire and time had begun, and though the music still played, those who listened carefully could hear new rhythms creeping in, the rhythms of change, of ending, of the vast wheel of history beginning its inexorable turn towards something that was not yet Rome, and perhaps never would be again. Imagine standing in a garden at twilight, watching shadows lengthen across perfectly ordered rows of olive trees and grapevines, when suddenly a wind rises from nowhere, bending everything toward some invisible storm. This was Rome in the year 235, when the Emperor Alexander Severus fell to assassins' blades in a German forest, and with his death, the empire entered what historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. Though crisis seems too small a word for what was really the slow-motion collapse of certainty itself. Picture the scene. A military camp in Mogontiacum, the morning mist rising from the Rhine like the breath of ghosts. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to their emperor now stood over his blood-soaked tent, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they had done. But this was not the calculated murder of tyrants. This was something new, something desperate. The army had killed not from hatred but from fear, fear that their young emperor was too weak to protect them from the barbarian hordes gathering like storm clouds beyond the river. And so began the age when emperors lasted months instead of years, when the purple became not a crown, but a death sentence. Count them if you can. Maximinus Thrax, the giant soldier emperor who never saw Rome. Gordian I and II, father and son who ruled together for 22 days before choosing death over defeat. Philip the Arab, who celebrated Rome's 1000th birthday while the empire bled from 1,000 wounds. The sound of this era was not the measured tread of legions on stone roads, but the clatter of hoofbeats as cavalry units switched allegiances, the scrape of hastily minted coins in merchants' hands, the whispered prayers of citizens who no longer knew which god to petition for protection. In the space of 50 years, 50 emperors would claim the throne, some ruling from distant camps, others barely outliving their coronations. Listen to the wind howling through the abandoned villas of Gaul, where Roman families packed their most precious possessions and fled south ahead of Germanic warbands. The very air seemed different now, charged with uncertainty, thick with the smoke of burning tax records and the dust of dismantled fortifications. The neat borders that had once seemed as permanent as mountain ranges began to blur and shift like ink running in rain. In the city of Rome itself, the morning sun still caught the golden dome of the Pantheon, still illuminated the marble columns of the Forum, but the light seemed somehow thinner, more fragile. Senators arrived at their meetings with personal guards, their togas concealing daggers, their speeches carefully crafted to offend no one. For who knew which general might march through the gates tomorrow, proclaiming himself the rightful heir to Augustus? The Praetorian Guard, once the elite protectors of emperors, had become kingmakers and kingslayers, auctioning the throne to the highest bidder in scenes that would have horrified the Republic's founders. Picture them in their scarlet cloaks, standing in the marble halls of the Castra Praetoria, counting gold coins while the fate of millions hung in the balance. The very institution created to protect the empire had become its tumor. Beyond the empire's fragmenting borders, the barbarian world was changing too. The Goths, originally from the distant shores of the Baltic, had migrated south like a slow-moving avalanche, displacing other tribes, creating pressure that built and built until something had to give. And when it gave, it would be along the Danube, where Roman engineers had once bridged mighty rivers, and Roman architects had built cities that gleamed like jewels against the wild landscape. But perhaps the most profound change was happening not in the councils of war or the chambers of power, but in the hearts of ordinary people. The old Roman virtues, duty, honor, the willingness to sacrifice for the state, were being slowly eroded by practical necessity. Why die for an emperor who might be dead before your letter reached home? Why pay taxes to a government that could not protect your fields from raiders? Why worship gods who seem to have turned their faces away from Rome? In Alexandria, the great lighthouse still guided ships into harbor, but the merchants who gathered in its shadow spoke increasingly of gods from the east, of Christ and Mithras, of salvation and eternal life. The old Roman compact, serve the state and the state will protect you, was breaking down, and people were looking elsewhere for meaning, for hope, for the promise that their sacrifices meant something more than temporary security. The plague, too, walked through the empire like a fever dream. It had come in waves since the time of Marcus Aurelius, invisible and inexorable, turning thriving cities into graveyards, leaving whole provinces depopulated and desolate. In Rome, the funeral pyres burned day and night, their smoke hanging over the 7 hills like a perpetual cloud, reminding everyone that death was democratic. It took senator and slave with equal indifference. And still the seasons turned, and still the empire endured, held together now not by strength but by momentum, by the sheer impossibility of imagining a world without Rome. Like a great tree whose roots have been cut, it stood for a while by habit, by the weight of its own history, while slow decay worked through every fiber of its being. The crisis would continue for decades more, but already in these dark years of the 3rd century, the shape of Rome's future was being carved by invisible hands. The military would grow stronger while civilian authority withered. The provinces would learn to fend for themselves, while the center grew weak. And in the hearts of its people, the empire would cease to be a dream worth dying for, becoming instead simply the only world they knew, familiar, failing, but still home. There comes a moment in every storm when the wind changes direction, when the pressure drops just enough to let you glimpse what's coming over the horizon. For Rome, that moment arrived with Diocletian, a Dalmatian soldier who seized the purple in 284 and looked upon the crumbling empire with the cold eyes of a man who had seen too many battles to believe in easy victories. He would try to save Rome by dividing it, like a physician cutting off a limb to save the body, never quite realizing that some wounds run too deep for any surgery to heal. Picture Diocletian on a winter morning in Nicomedia, his new eastern capital, standing before a window that looked out over the Bosphorus. The water was grey as old pewter, and ships from a dozen provinces bobbed at anchor in the harbour. Grain ships from Egypt, wine ships from Greece, vessels laden with silk and spices from the mysterious lands beyond Persia. The wealth of the world still flowed toward Rome, but now it had to be forced through channels that grew narrower each year, like blood through the veins of an aging giant. He had divided the empire between east and west, creating a system of 4 rulers, the Tetrarchy, hoping that more hands could hold what one pair could no longer grasp. In the west, Maximian ruled from Milan. In the east, Diocletian governed from his new palace complex by the sea. 2 Caesars served beneath them, waiting their turn to inherit a throne that had become less a prize than a burden. It was an elegant solution, born of desperation and mathematical precision, but it could not solve the fundamental problem. Rome was trying to hold back the tide with increasingly tired hands. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, the barbarian world was stirring with new energy. The great migrations had begun, not invasions in any classical sense, but the slow movement of entire peoples driven by pressures from the distant steppes, where the Huns rode like demons out of nightmare, displacing everyone in their path. Imagine these migrations not as armies marching in formation, but as rivers of humanity flowing across the landscape. Women with children on their shoulders, warriors with war paint fading in the rain, elderly shamans carrying the sacred objects of tribes whose names would soon be forgotten. The Goths were no longer the savage raiders of earlier centuries. They had learned much from their contact with Rome, how to forge better weapons, how to organize larger armies, how to build siege engines that could crack the walls of cities. But they had also learned something more dangerous. They had learned that Romans were human, that their armies could be defeated, their cities taken, their pride humbled. The aura of invincibility that had protected Rome for so long was dissolving like morning mist. In the amber light of a Gothic campfire, warriors who had fought alongside Roman armies as foederati, allied troops, now planned their own campaigns against Roman territories. They knew the empire's weaknesses intimately, which fortresses were undermanned, which governors could be bribed, which provinces were ripe for conquest. Some had even served in the Roman military, rising to positions of command, learning the secrets of Roman tactics and Roman administration from the inside. The sound of this era was not the clash of armies meeting in formal battle, but the creak of wagon wheels on muddy roads, the lowing of cattle being driven across rivers, the crying of children who would grow up never knowing the land their grandparents had called home. These were not invasions but immigrations, not conquests but the slow, irresistible pressure of people seeking safety, seeking land, seeking a future that the steppes could no longer provide. Diocletian's reforms had brought temporary stability, but at a cost that few Romans fully understood. The empire had become more like a fortress than a civilization, everything organized for defense, everyone classified by function, mobility restricted, professions hereditary. The son of a baker must be a baker, the son of a soldier must be a soldier. Freedom, that old Roman virtue, was being sacrificed on the altar of security, and the altar was growing hungrier each year. In Rome itself, the old senators still met in their marble hall, still debated matters of state with the elaborate courtesy of their ancestors, but they had become museum pieces, living relics of a system that no longer quite existed. Real power now lay with the army commanders on the frontiers, with the administrators in the new capitals, with anyone who could promise protection in an increasingly dangerous world. Christianity, too, was changing the empire from within. What had begun as a religion of slaves and outcasts was becoming the faith of emperors and generals. Constantine, still decades in the future, would make it official, but already the cross was beginning to replace the eagle as the symbol men died for. In the catacombs beneath Rome, in the secret churches of Alexandria and Antioch, a new vision of empire was taking shape, not bound by rivers or ruled by force of arms, but held together by shared faith and the promise of salvation. The barbarians themselves were changing as well. Some sought not to destroy Rome but to join it, to become Romans themselves, while keeping their own gods and customs. They had seen the cities, tasted the wine, felt the smooth roads beneath their feet, and they wanted these things for their children. But they wanted them on their own terms, not as subjects, but as partners. And this Rome, despite all its talk of citizenship and law, had never quite learned how to offer. On quiet nights when the wind died down and the campfires burned low, you could almost hear the future taking shape in the darkness. Not the future that Romans expected, eternal dominion, endless expansion, the triumph of civilization over barbarism, but a different future. One where the distinctions between Roman and barbarian would blur and fade, where new kingdoms would rise from the ashes of the old, where the very idea of what it meant to be civilized would have to be reimagined. The barbarian tide was rising, but it was not a tide of destruction. It was a tide of transformation, carrying with it the seeds of a new world that would be neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but something unprecedented, something that had never existed before. The medieval world, where Roman law would blend with Germanic custom, where Christian faith would mix with pagan tradition, where the ghost of Caesar would dance with the spirits of the forest in ways that neither Roman nor barbarian could yet imagine. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 28, 312, a man stood on the banks of the Tiber, watching the mist rise from the water like the breath of sleeping gods. Constantine, son of Constantius, claimant to the purple, gazed across the river toward Rome, while his army stirred behind him like a beast waking from dreams. Tomorrow would bring the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and with it, a transformation so profound that the empire emerging from the smoke would bear only the name of its predecessor. But tonight, in the space between sleeping and waking, between the old world and the new, Constantine claimed to have seen something in the sky, a sign, a promise, a vision that would change not just his fate, but the fate of everyone who would ever call themselves Roman. Whether it was the Christian Chi-Rho symbol or the sun god's crown of light hardly mattered. What mattered was that a Roman emperor had decided to stake his throne on the power of a god who promised not worldly victory, but eternal salvation. Listen to the sound of armor being blessed by Christian priests instead of pagan augurs, of soldiers painting crosses on their shields instead of eagles, of prayers offered not to Mars the warbringer, but to Christ the peacemaker. This was revolution disguised as military strategy, the quiet overturning of everything Rome had stood for during 8 centuries of conquest and glory. The battle itself was swift and brutal. Maxentius, Constantine's rival, drowned in the Tiber's brown waters, his body armored in gold, but weighted down by the currents of history. When Constantine entered Rome in triumph, riding beneath arches that had celebrated a dozen pagan victories, he carried with him the promise of a new covenant, not between emperor and senate, not between ruler and ruled, but between heaven and earth, mediated by a carpenter's son from an obscure province. Imagine the shock rippling through the Roman world like earthquake tremors. In the temples of Jupiter and Mars, priests found their altars growing cold, their offerings refused, their ancient rituals suddenly seeming as outdated as bronze weapons in an iron age. The old gods, who had guided Rome from a collection of hills to master of the world, were being gently but firmly retired, like veterans given a pension and sent to live quietly in the countryside. But this was not the sudden conversion of a people desperate for salvation. Christianity had been growing in Roman soil for 3 centuries, sending down roots through every layer of society. In the slave quarters and the senators' villas, in the army camps and the merchant guilds, the new faith had been spreading like morning glory vines, beautiful and inevitable, wrapping themselves around the structures of the old world until no one could say where Rome ended and Christianity began. Constantine himself embodied this transformation. He delayed his baptism until his deathbed, as was common then, but he surrounded himself with Christian advisors, built Christian churches, and gradually reshaped Roman law to reflect Christian values. The gladiatorial games, those bloody spectacles that had entertained Romans for centuries, began to fade. Crucifixion, the empire's favorite method of executing criminals and rebels, was abolished. Slavery remained, but slaves gained new protections, new dignity, new hope that their suffering might have meaning beyond this world. In the great Basilica of St. Peter, rising where the apostle had been martyred centuries before, you could hear something new in the empire's voice, not the harsh commands of absolute power, but the gentler tones of a civilization trying to learn mercy. The marble columns still soared toward heaven, the mosaics still glittered with gold, but they told different stories now, not of conquest and triumph, but of sacrifice and redemption, of a kingdom not of this world, but somehow dwelling within it. The theological debates that shook the 4th century might seem like arcane disputes to modern ears, but they were really arguments about the nature of reality itself. In the great councils at Nicaea and Constantinople, bishops from across the empire gathered to define not just Christian doctrine, but the spiritual foundations of Roman civilization. When they declared that Christ was fully divine and fully human, they were also declaring that the material world, including the Roman Empire, could be sanctified, could become a vehicle for divine purpose. But transformation always comes with a price, and Rome's Christian revolution was no exception. The old Roman virtues, courage in battle, loyalty to the state, the willingness to die for honor, were being replaced by new ideals: humility, forgiveness, the willingness to turn the other cheek. These were beautiful virtues, but they were also dangerous ones for an empire that still faced enemies on every frontier, that still needed soldiers willing to kill and die for purely earthly reasons. The barbarians watching from beyond the Rhine and Danube sensed this change like wolves scenting weakness in the wind. Some of them were Christians too now, Arian Christians mostly, followers of a theology that Rome had declared heretical, but they understood that a Christian Rome might be more vulnerable than a pagan one, more hesitant to use the brutal methods that had built the empire in the first place. In the monasteries that were beginning to appear like islands of prayer in a sea of worldly concerns, men and women were pioneering a new way of being Roman, defined not by citizenship or military service, but by spiritual discipline and devotion to God. These monks and nuns would preserve classical learning through the dark centuries ahead, copying manuscripts by candlelight, while barbarian kingdoms rose and fell around them, keeping alive the memory of what Rome had been while preparing the way for what it might become. Julian the Apostate, Constantine's nephew, tried briefly to turn back the tide, to restore the old gods and the old ways. For 3 short years, he reopened pagan temples, banned Christians from teaching, and dreamed of returning Rome to its pre-Christian glory. But when he died in Persia in 363, Pierced by a spear while fighting the Sassanids, his last words reportedly were, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean," acknowledging that the revolution was complete, that Rome was Christian now, for better and for worse. The sound of this new Rome was the sound of Gregorian chant, echoing through basilicas that had once rung with the cheers of gladiator crowds, of church bells marking the hours where once only the sun and stars had measured time, of prayers in Latin slowly replacing the ancient formulas by which Romans had once sought to bend the gods to their will. It was the sound of an empire learning to see itself not as the conqueror of the world, but as a servant of heaven. A beautiful dream, perhaps, but one that would prove difficult to sustain when the barbarians came calling with swords instead of prayers. On a hill overlooking the golden waters of the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia have whispered to each other across narrow straits since the world was young, Constantine had built his new Rome, Constantinople, the city that would be. But by 378, as Emperor Valens lay dead on the battlefield of Adrianople and Gothic horsemen watered their horses in Roman blood, even this glittering jewel of the East began to seem less like a promise of renewal than a desperate attempt to preserve something that was already slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The news of Adrianople reached the Western Court in Milan like a cold wind through an open door. Gratian, barely 23 and suddenly the senior emperor of a divided world, must have felt the weight of centuries settling on his shoulders as he read the dispatches by flickering candlelight. 2/3 of the Eastern army destroyed, the emperor dead, the Goths rampaging through Thrace like a fire consuming dry grass. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the immediate crisis, the sound of other barbarian peoples stirring, sensing weakness, like predators catching the scent of wounded prey. But empires, like the human heart, are remarkably resilient things. What cannot be held together by strength can sometimes be preserved by wisdom, and Gratian possessed enough wisdom to recognize what his ancestors had been reluctant to admit, that Rome had grown too vast, too complex, too diverse to be governed by any single hand, no matter how capable or well-intentioned. The decision to elevate Theodosius the Furor to rule the East was made not in the marble halls of the Senate, but in a military camp where the practical needs of survival trumped the ancient customs of Roman politics. Theodosius was a Spaniard, a general who understood that the empire's future lay not in trying to restore its past glory, but in adapting to new realities with the flexibility of a river finding its way around stones. Picture the scene in Constantinople as the new emperor took his throne. The great city rising from 7 hills like Rome itself, but younger, more vibrant, less burdened by the weight of ancient ghosts. The Hagia Sophia, not yet the magnificent cathedral that Justinian would build, but still a wonder of the world, caught the morning light and scattered it across waters where ships from India and Britain rode at anchor together, their holds full of silk and amber, spices and furs, the wealth of half the world flowing toward this new center of power. Theodosius was the last emperor who would rule both East and West, the last man to wear the purple of undivided Rome. But even as he consolidated his power, even as he defeated the Goths and settled them as foederati within the empire's borders, he must have sensed that he was presiding not over a restoration, but over a transformation so profound that the Rome emerging from it would be Roman in name only. The sound of this era was the sound of adaptation, Gothic warriors singing Christian hymns in their native tongue, Roman bureaucrats learning barbarian languages to better administer their new subjects, merchants conducting business in Latin, Greek, and half a dozen Germanic dialects as trade routes shifted to accommodate new political realities. The empire was becoming something unprecedented, a multicultural, multilingual, multinational state, held together not by force of arms alone, but by shared participation in Roman institutions and Roman dreams. In the western provinces, too, change was stirring like sap rising in spring trees. The great estates of Gaul and Spain were being managed increasingly by their barbarian tenants, Germanic settlers who had learned Roman agricultural techniques while maintaining their own social structures. Roman law still governed these lands, but it was Roman law interpreted through barbarian customs, applied by barbarian judges, enforced by barbarian soldiers who swore their oaths in accented Latin but dreamed their dreams in their fathers' tongues. Christianity provided the binding force that military conquest alone could no longer supply. When Theodosius made Christianity the empire's official religion in 380, he was not simply endorsing a faith, but acknowledging a reality, that the empire's diverse peoples needed something more than citizenship to unite them, something deeper than political allegiance to inspire their loyalty. The Christian God was a universal God, equally available to Roman and Goth, to patrician and slave, to the sophisticated urbanite and the simple farmer working his plot of earth in some distant valley. But universality comes with its own complications. The theological disputes that had seemed merely academic in Constantine's time now threatened to tear the empire apart along doctrinal lines. Arianism, popular among the Gothic tribes, competed with Orthodox Christianity for the souls of the faithful. In the eastern provinces, Monophysite Christians argued with their Chalcedonian neighbors about the precise nature of Christ's divinity, while Persian armies gathered on the frontier. Unity of faith, it seemed, was as elusive as unity of arms. The Empress Helena, Theodosius's second wife and a devout Christian, spent her days visiting monasteries and churches, distributing alms to the poor and patronizing scholars who translated Greek philosophy into Latin for Western audiences. In her, we can see the new type of Roman emerging, pious where their ancestors had been practical, contemplative where they had been active, concerned with salvation, where earlier Romans had focused on conquest. When Theodosius died in 395, he divided the empire between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. It was meant to be a temporary arrangement, a practical solution to the problem of governing vast territories while dealing with hostile neighbors. But temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent, and the division of 395 would prove to be the beginning of the end for the unified Roman Empire. The two halves of the empire, like siblings who have grown apart, began to develop different languages, different customs, different priorities. The East, with its Greek heritage and its proximity to the rich provinces of Egypt and Syria, could afford to be more intellectual, more theological, more concerned with abstract questions of faith and philosophy. The West, pressed by barbarian migrations and economically dependent on the uncertain revenues of Gaul and Spain, became more militarized, more practical, more focused on the immediate problems of survival. Yet for a brief moment in the twilight of the 4th century, it was still possible to imagine that this division might work, that East and West might function as two lungs breathing life into a single body. The road still connected Constantinople to Milan, Roman law still governed from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, and Latin remained the language of administration even where Greek was the language of culture. The dream of Rome, eternal, universal, invincible, flickered on like a candle in a draught, growing smaller but refusing to be extinguished. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, you could almost hear the empire's heartbeat, slower now but still strong, still steady, still keeping time to rhythms that had begun when Rome was nothing but a collection of mud huts on Italian hills. The transformation was not yet complete, the ending not yet written. There was still time for surprises, still room for hope, still space for the possibility that what seemed like decline might yet prove to be rebirth. In the forests beyond the Danube, where ancient oaks caught starlight in their branches, and the wind carried the scent of snow from distant mountains, a young Gothic prince learned to read the future in the flight of ravens. His name was Alaric, and he would grow up to cast a shadow longer than any Roman emperor, a shadow that would fall across the 7 hills and darken the forum where Cicero had once spoken of eternal glory. But in those early years of the 5th century, as the boy became a man and the man became a king, Rome still glittered like a jewel in the Italian sun, still drew pilgrims and ambassadors from the edges of the known world, still seemed as permanent as the hills on which it stood. The city that had survived Hannibal and Spartacus, that had weathered civil wars and barbarian raids, surely could not fall to a band of displaced Goths, no matter how clever their king or how desperate their need for land. Listen to the sound of this time, not the clash of armies in formal battle, but the creak of wagon wheels on muddy roads, the lowing of cattle being driven toward new pastures, the prayers of Gothic mothers holding their children close as they crossed rivers that had no names in any language they knew. This was not conquest in the old Roman sense, not legions marching in formation behind eagles of gold. This was something stranger and more dangerous, a people in motion, carrying their entire world with them, seeking not plunder but a place to belong. Alaric himself was a paradox, a barbarian king who spoke Latin as fluently as his native Gothic, who had served in the Roman army and learned Roman tactics from Roman generals, who understood the empire's weaknesses because he had once been sworn to defend its strengths. In his tent at night, by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on canvas walls, he studied maps drawn by Roman cartographers, planned campaigns using Roman military manuals, and dreamed of a kingdom that would be both Gothic and civilized, both free and secure. The Western Emperor Honorius, barely 10 years old when his father Theodosius died, ruled from Ravenna now, not from Rome, but from a new capital built in the marshes of the Adriatic coast, surrounded by lagoons and defended by geography rather than walls. It was a telling choice, this retreat to a fortress city where the emperor could be safe from the very people he claimed to rule. The boy emperor, guided by his regent Stilicho, lived in splendid isolation while his empire fragmented around him like ice breaking up in spring. Stilicho himself was another paradox of this strange time, a Vandal by birth who had become the most Roman of Romans, a barbarian general who spent his life fighting other barbarians in defense of an empire that would never fully trust him because of his origins. He understood Alaric because he was like Alaric, a man caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, seeking to create something new from the fragments of the old. For 15 years, these two men, the Gothic king and the Vandal regent, danced around each other like shadows at sunset, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always aware that their fates were intertwined in ways that went deeper than politics or warfare. They fought battles that neither truly won, signed treaties that neither intended to keep, and slowly, without quite realizing it, began to reshape the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. In the marble halls of Ravenna, courtiers whispered that Stilicho was too friendly with the barbarians, too willing to negotiate when he should have been fighting, too ready to grant settlements when he should have been demanding unconditional surrender. They were right in their way, but they failed to understand that the old methods no longer worked, that the empire could no longer afford to treat every barbarian tribe as an enemy to be destroyed, rather than a potential ally to be accommodated. Alaric, meanwhile, was learning his own painful lessons about the nature of power and the limits of force. Twice he had led his people south across the Alps, twice he had stood before the walls of Rome itself, and twice he had been forced to withdraw without achieving his ultimate goal, a secure homeland for his people within the empire's borders. The Goths were growing restless, questioning their king's strategy, whispering that perhaps it was time to abandon negotiation and simply take what they needed. The turning point came in 408, when jealousy and fear finally overcame prudence in the imperial court. Stilicho, accused of treason and conspiracy, was executed on the orders of the emperor he had served so faithfully. With his death, the last voice of reason in the Western government was silenced, and the last hope for a peaceful settlement with the Goths died with him. Picture the scene. Alaric receiving the news of Stilicho's death in his camp somewhere north of the Alps, his weathered face showing no emotion as the messenger delivered his report. But those who knew the Gothic king well might have noticed the way his hands tightened on the arms of his chair, the way his eyes grew distant as he contemplated a future that suddenly seemed both simpler and more terrible than anything he had previously imagined. The negotiations that followed were a farce, conducted by Roman officials who had neither the authority to offer what Alaric needed, nor the wisdom to understand what was at stake. The Goths asked for land, for recognition, for the right to live as federates within the empire, while maintaining their own customs and leadership. The Romans offered gold, always gold, as if the problem was simply one of price rather than dignity, as if 30 years of displacement and uncertainty could be solved with a payment that would last a season. When the talking finally stopped, when the last embassy had returned empty-handed to Ravenna, Alaric made the decision that would echo through history like thunder rolling across distant hills. He would march on Rome not as a suppliant seeking favor, but as a conqueror demanding satisfaction. If the empire would not grant his people a place within its borders willingly, then he would carve out that place with Gothic steel. The siege of Rome in 408 was unlike anything the city had experienced in 8 centuries. No foreign enemy had stood before its walls since Hannibal, and that had been in a different age, when Rome was still young and hungry, still capable of summoning the fierce energy that had made it master of the world. Now the city was old, its walls maintained more for show than for defense, its people accustomed to thinking of warfare as something that happened in distant provinces to other people. Alaric was not interested in destroying Rome, only enforcing it to negotiate seriously. He cut the city's supply lines but did not assault its walls, allowing hunger and fear to do the work that siege engines might have accomplished more quickly but less discriminately. The sound of this siege was not the crash of catapults, but the quieter sounds of a city slowly strangling. The scrape of metal on stone as citizens searched for food, the whispered prayers in empty churches, the shuffle of feet as senators who had never known want learned what it meant to go hungry. The city held out for months, sustained by the stubborn pride of its people and the hope that relief would come from Ravenna. But Honorius, safe in his marsh-protected capital, seemed more concerned with court ceremonies than with the fate of the eternal city. When a relief force finally did arrive, it was too small and too late, easily scattered by Gothic cavalry who had learned to fight like Romans while remaining as mobile as the nomads their ancestors had been. The negotiations that ended the first siege were conducted by Pope Innocent III, who walked out to Alaric's camp carrying not the authority of emperors, but the moral weight of the church. In this, we see another sign of the changing times. Temporal power was failing, but spiritual authority still commanded respect, even from barbarian kings who had grown up hearing stories of Christ's mercy and divine justice. Alaric accepted a ransom in gold and silver, in silk and spices, in pepper and precious objects, but he also extracted something more valuable, a promise that serious negotiations would begin for a permanent settlement of his people. The Goths withdrew from Rome's walls, but they did not withdraw far, camping in the Tuscan hills like wolves waiting for the shepherd to lower his guard. But promises made under duress are often forgotten once the immediate danger passes, and the imperial court in Ravenna quickly returned to its old habits of delay and deception. A year passed, then another, with envoys traveling back and forth between the Gothic camp and the imperial palace, each carrying offers that fell short of what was needed, demands that went beyond what was possible, and the growing certainty that words alone would not resolve this crisis. In 410, Alaric's patience finally ran out. On August 24th, as the summer heat shimmered off Roman stones and the city dozed in the afternoon sun, Gothic horns sounded from the Campus Martius. This time, there would be no siege, no negotiations, no mercy. The gates of Rome would open. Some said they were opened by slaves who had no loyalty to masters who fed them barely enough to live. Others claimed they were opened by senators who preferred accommodation to annihilation. It hardly mattered. What mattered was that for the first time in 800 years, a foreign army walked through the streets of Rome as conquerors. The sack that followed was remarkably restrained by the standards of the age. Alaric, a Christian king leading a largely Christian army, had given orders that churches were to be respected, that non-combatants were to be spared, that the city's cultural treasures were to be preserved. This was not the mindless destruction that Romans feared from barbarians, but something more disturbing, a careful, systematic assertion of power by men who understood exactly what Rome represented and intended to claim that heritage for themselves. The sound of Rome's fall was not the sound of destruction, but of transformation. Gothic voices echoing in marble halls, where only Latin had been heard for centuries, barbarian hands turning the pages of books that contained the wisdom of ages, foreign feet walking on stones that had been laid by Caesar's engineers. Rome was not being destroyed, it was being inherited, claimed by a people who had learned to love what they had once sought only to plunder. Across the Mediterranean, where ancient Phoenician ships had once carried purple dye and silver coins, a new wind was rising. It carried the scent of unfamiliar spices, the sound of unfamiliar languages, and the promise of changes that would make Alaric's capture of Rome seem like the gentle knock of a friendly visitor. The Vandals were coming, and with them a reminder that the sea, which had once been Rome's private lake, could become its greatest vulnerability. In the aftermath of Rome's sack, as the Eternal City slowly swept the debris from its streets and tried to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed, the Western Empire faced a crisis that made all previous troubles seem like minor inconveniences. The Visigoths, under Alaric's successor, had settled in southern Gaul and Spain, establishing the first barbarian kingdom on Roman soil. The Burgundians were carving out their own territory in the Rhone Valley. And in distant Britain, the legions had been withdrawn, leaving Romano-British communities to face Saxon raiders, with nothing but local militias and fading memories of imperial protection. But it was in North Africa that the most devastating blow was about to fall. The Vandals, led by their king Genseric, had crossed from Spain into Morocco in 429, bringing with them their families, their cattle, their portable forges, and their fierce determination never again to be displaced by anyone. Picture them. 80,000 souls crowded onto every available ship, their eyes fixed on the green coast of Africa, while their hearts carried the memory of every forced migration, every broken treaty, every promise that had turned to ash in their mouths. Hippo Regius fell after a siege of 14 months, its walls finally breached not by Vandal catapults, but by hunger and despair. Among the last defenders was Augustine, the great theologian whose City of God had tried to reconcile Roman civilization with Christian faith. He died during the siege, his final words a prayer not for Roman victory, but for divine mercy on all the suffering children of men, barbarian and Roman alike. In his death, the last great voice of classical Christian thought was silenced, and with it died a vision of empire that might have been both holy and humane. The sound of the Vandal conquest was the sound of ships' hulls grinding against African beaches, of horses' hooves on roads that had carried Roman grain to Italy for 4 centuries, of Arian hymns echoing in basilicas where Augustine had preached his sermons on love and grace. This was not the patient diplomacy that had sometimes characterized Gothic Roman relations, but the swift, inexorable advance of a people who had learned that survival meant taking what they needed before someone else could take it from them. Genseric was perhaps the most formidable of all the barbarian kings, a man who combined Gothic ferocity with Roman cunning and a strategic vision that stretched far beyond the immediate needs of his people. He understood that whoever controlled North Africa controlled the grain supply that fed Rome and Constantinople. He understood that whoever commanded the Mediterranean could strangle the sea routes that held the empire together. And he understood that the Romans, for all their pride and their ancient prestige, were no longer capable of defending what they claimed to own. Carthage fell in 439, and with it, the last pretense that Roman power extended beyond what Roman arms could actually defend. The great port that had once challenged Rome for mastery of the western Mediterranean became the capital of a Vandal kingdom that would endure for a century, sending its fleets to raid Sicily and Sardinia, Corsica, and the Italian coast, reminding Romans daily that the sea was no longer their friend but their enemy. In Ravenna, the Emperor Valentinian III received these reports with the detached interest of a man reading about disasters in a distant land. His court had become a theatre where the same old ceremonies were performed for an audience that grew smaller each year, where the same old titles were bestowed on men who commanded nothing but their own household guards, where the same old claims to universal authority were made in Latin that fewer and fewer people understood or cared to understand. Real power in the Western Empire now lay with a Hunnic general named Flavius Aetius, the last of the Romans, who kept the empire alive through a combination of barbarian alliances, military skill, and the kind of pragmatic flexibility that earlier Romans might have considered shameful, but which had become the only alternative to complete collapse. Aetius understood that the empire could no longer conquer. It could only survive, and survival meant making deals with barbarian kings, treating former enemies as allies, and slowly transforming conquest into accommodation. The great crisis came in 451, when Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, led a vast coalition of barbarian peoples across the Rhine into Gaul. This was no ordinary raid, but something unprecedented. A nomad confederation that included Huns and Gepids, Ostrogoths and Rugians, all united under a king who claimed to rule from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Germany. Picture the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where the fate of Western Europe hung in the balance for a single day in late summer. On one side stood Attila, with his polyglot army of nomads and Germans. On the other, Aetius with a coalition that would have been unimaginable a century earlier, Romans and Visigoths fighting side by side, former enemies united by the common recognition that some threats were greater than their mutual hatreds. The battle itself was a slaughter that left the plain littered with the bodies of kings and common soldiers alike. But when the sun set on that bloody field, Attila was retreating eastward, and Western Europe remained unconquered. It was perhaps the last time that Roman arms could claim a great victory, the last time that the old military virtues proved sufficient to preserve what remained of the Western Empire. But victories, in that dying age, were often more dangerous than defeats. Aetius returned from the Catalonian plains with too much prestige for his own good, too much popularity for Valentinian III to tolerate. In 454, the emperor personally murdered his most successful general during what was supposed to be a routine audience, striking down with his own hand the man who had saved his empire. When someone asked Valentinian if he understood what he had done, the emperor replied that he had freed himself from a master. When they pointed out that he had cut off his right hand with his left, he had no answer. The following year, Valentinian himself was dead, killed by two of Aetius's former bodyguards who had found their own opportunity for revenge. And with both emperor and general gone, the Western Empire's last restraints on chaos were removed. The Vandals, watching from across the sea, saw their opportunity and took it. Genseric's fleet appeared off the mouth of the Tiber on a spring morning in 455. Their sails white against the blue sky like clouds promising storm. This time there would be no siege, no negotiation, no hope of relief. Pope Leo the Ferren met the Vandal king at the gates of Rome and extracted a promise that the sack would be conducted without unnecessary bloodshed. But beyond that, the eternal city was at the mercy of men who had learned mercy from Roman examples and found them wanting. For 14 days, the Vandals methodically stripped Rome of everything portable and valuable. Unlike Alaric's relatively restrained occupation, this was professional plundering conducted by men who understood exactly what they were taking and what it was worth. Gold and silver, silk and spices, works of art and sacred relics, everything that represented the accumulated wealth of 8 centuries of conquest was loaded onto Vandal ships and carried across the sea to Carthage. When the Vandals finally sailed away, they left behind a city that was still standing, but somehow fundamentally altered, like a person who has survived a serious illness but never quite recovers their former strength. Rome remained the theoretical capital of a theoretical empire, but everyone knew now that the title meant nothing without the power to enforce it. The age of barbarian kingdoms was no longer coming. It had arrived, and the future belonged to men like Genseric who understood that the old world was ending and were prepared to shape whatever world might replace it. In the soft twilight of a September evening in 455, as shadows lengthened across the forum and the last merchants packed their wares away from empty stalls, Rome felt like a theater after the final performance, still magnificent in its architecture, still echoing with memories of past glories, but somehow hollow, waiting for an audience that would never return. The Vandals had sailed away with their treasure ships heavy in the water, and what remained was an empire that existed mostly in the imagination of men who remembered when the title Caesar had made distant kings tremble. The emperors who followed Valentinian III were like actors playing roles in a drama whose plot had already been decided by other hands. Petronius Maximus lasted 11 weeks before being torn apart by a Roman mob angry at his weakness. Helvitus, proclaimed by the Visigoths, governed for little more than a year before being deposed by his own generals. Majorian, who might have been a new Augustus in a different age, was murdered after 5 years of trying to restore what could not be restored. Listen to the names as they echo through these final decades like autumn leaves falling: Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos. Most ruled for months rather than years, their authority extending barely beyond the walls of Ravenna. Their edicts ignored by barbarian kings who had once been their federates and now were becoming their replacements. The imperial purple had become not a crown but a curse, passed from hand to hand like a poisoned chalice that no one could safely drink from, but no one dared to set aside. Yet in this twilight time, as the Western Empire flickered like a candle in a draught, there was still beauty to be found in the stubborn persistence of Roman ideals. In the monasteries that dotted the Italian countryside, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of Virgil and Cicero for generations yet unborn. In the law schools of Beirut and Constantinople, students still studied the elegant principles of Roman jurisprudence, that great gift to the future that would outlive legions and emperors alike. The real power in these final years belonged not to emperors, but to barbarian generalissimos, men like Ricimer the Suevian, who made and unmade emperors with the casual efficiency of a farmer selecting tools for different seasons. Ricimer understood that the forms of Roman government still mattered, that legitimacy required the fiction of imperial authority even when that authority was exercised by barbarian hands. For 16 years, he was the true ruler of what remained of the Western Empire, governing through puppet emperors, while the barbarian kingdoms grew stronger around him. Picture Ricimer in his palace at Ravenna, not the imperial palace, for he was careful to maintain the distinctions that preserved the illusion of Roman continuity, but a magnificent residence that nonetheless made clear where real power lay. Here he received embassies from Vandal kings and Visigothic nobles, negotiated treaties with Burgundian princes and Saxon war chiefs, conducted the complex diplomacy that kept what remained of the empire from complete collapse. The irony was profound. Rome in its final decades was being preserved by the very barbarians it had once sought to exclude. Germanic generals commanded what remained of the Roman army. Gothic and Vandal advisors counseled Roman emperors. Frankish merchants traded in markets that had once been exclusively Roman. The empire was being transformed from within by the same peoples it had spent centuries trying to keep beyond its borders. In Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom centered on Toulouse had become more stable and prosperous than the Roman territories around it. King Euric, ruling from his palace where Roman mosaics covered floors trod by Gothic boots, issued laws that blended Roman jurisprudence with Germanic custom, creating something new, a barbarian kingdom that was also, in its own way, a Roman successor state. The Burgundians in the Rhone Valley told similar stories. King Gundobad, who had spent years as a hostage in Ravenna and spoke Latin as fluently as his native tongue, governed a realm where Roman senators sat alongside Germanic nobles in councils that conducted their business in both languages. The old Roman villa system continued to function, but now it was Germanic lords who collected the rents and Roman tenants who worked the fields. Even in Britain, abandoned by the legions decades earlier, Roman influence persisted in unexpected ways. The Saxon kingdoms that were emerging from the chaos of the post-Roman period retained Roman place names, Roman roads, and scattered memories of Roman lore. A British king named Arthur, if he existed at all, was said to have fought for Roman values against Saxon barbarism, carrying the old dream of civilized order into a new and darker age. But perhaps the most telling transformation was happening in the church. Christianity, which had begun as a religion of the dispossessed, was becoming the primary carrier of Roman culture and Roman values. When barbarian kings converted to Christianity, they were also, in a sense, converting to Romanness, adopting Latin as their liturgical language, Roman law as their legal framework, Roman administrative practices as their model of governance. The sound of this dying empire was the sound of Latin hymns sung in Gothic accents, of Roman law debated in Germanic dialects, of classical poetry recited in monasteries where the scribes wore the rough robes of monks but carried in their heads the accumulated wisdom of 8 centuries of Roman literature. Civilization was not dying. It was changing its clothes, learning new languages, adapting to new circumstances, while preserving what was most essential about the Roman vision of order and justice. In 472, Ricimer died, and with him died the last effective government the Western Empire would know. His successor, his nephew Gundobad, lasted only months before abandoning Ravenna to claim his inheritance as king of the Burgundians. The Emperor Olybrius, Ricimer's final puppet, died soon after. For 4 years, the Western Empire existed in a state of suspension, neither alive nor quite dead, waiting for someone to decide its fate. That someone was Orestes, a Roman general who had once served as secretary to Attila the Hun, another of those paradoxical figures who embodied the blending of Roman and barbarian that characterized the age. Orestes deposed the emperor Julius Nepos in 475 and placed his own son, Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. The boy was barely 10 years old, his name a cruel irony. Romulus for the founder of Rome, Augustus for its first emperor, Augustulus meaning little Augustus in the diminutive form that Romans used for beloved children. The final act began a year later, when Orestes' barbarian troops, Heruli and Rugians, Scyrri and Gepids, demanded what barbarian troops had been demanding for generations: land on which to settle, a place to call home within the empire's borders. When Orestes refused, they turned to their own leader, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who understood that the time for half-measures had passed. On September 4th, 476, Odoacer's troops entered Ravenna without resistance. Orestes was captured and executed, but his son was treated with the courtesy due to a child who had never asked for the burden thrust upon him. Romulus Augustulus was deposed gently, pensioned off to a villa in Campania, where he could live out his days in comfortable obscurity, the last emperor of the West forgotten by history until centuries later, when scholars would mark his fall as the end of an age. But Odoacer did something unprecedented. He did not proclaim himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, the scepter and golden orb, to Constantinople, to Zeno, emperor of the East. The message was clear. There was no longer any need for two emperors, no longer any Western empire to govern. The barbarian kingdoms would rule themselves, acknowledging the Eastern emperor as the heir to Roman legitimacy, while exercising all real power in their own hands. The Western Roman Empire had ended not with a bang but with a sigh, not in the crash of battle, but in the quiet recognition that forms of government must sometimes change to preserve the substance of civilization. Rome had fallen, but Romanness would survive, carried forward by barbarian kings who had learned to love what they had conquered, preserved in laws and languages, in customs and dreams, in the thousand small ways that ideas outlive the institutions that first gave them birth. While the western sun set behind the 7 hills of Rome, another dawn was breaking over the golden domes of Constantinople, where the Eastern Empire, that fragment of Roman glory that would call itself Byzantine but never forgot its Roman heart, prepared to carry the imperial dream into a future that would stretch for another 1,000 years. In the great palace overlooking the Bosphorus, emperors who spoke Greek but dreamed in Latin faced eastward toward Persia and southward toward the endless sands of Arabia, unaware that their greatest glories and most bitter defeats still lay ahead. The Emperor Zeno, who had received the Western regalia from Odoacer with all the ceremony due to symbols that had lost their substance, understood that he was now the sole heir to Augustus and Constantine, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. But inheritance is not the same as possession, and the Eastern Empire of the late 5th century was itself a creature transformed almost beyond recognition from the Rome that had once ruled from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Listen to the sounds of this new Constantinople, not the harsh Latin of military commands, but the melodious Greek of theologians debating the nature of Christ, not the tramp of legions, but the chanting of monks whose prayers rose like incense from 100 monasteries, not the roar of crowds in the Colosseum, but the more civilized enthusiasm of spectators in the Hippodrome, where chariot races had become the closest thing to democratic politics that the empire would allow. This was an empire of merchants and theologians, of silk traders and icon painters, of diplomats who could quote Homer and generals who crossed themselves before battle. The bureaucracy that governed it, was more complex than anything Rome had ever imagined. A vast web of titles and ceremonies, protocols and precedences that kept the machinery of state running with clockwork precision, while the emperor himself became increasingly remote from his subjects, more symbol than man, more icon than ruler. Yet for all its Byzantine complexity, this Eastern Empire retained something essential that the West had lost: the ability to adapt, to bend without breaking, to absorb new influences while maintaining its core identity. When barbarian kingdoms rose and fell in the former Western provinces, Constantinople endured. When Arab armies swept out of the desert to conquer Syria and Egypt, the empire contracted but survived. When Turkish nomads pressed against its Anatolian frontiers, it found new sources of strength in trade and diplomacy, in the flexible resilience that would characterize Byzantine civilization for a millennium. The great test came with Justinian, who ascended the throne in 527 with dreams of restoration that would have seemed impossible to his predecessors. Picture him, a peasant son from the mountains of Illyria, who had clawed his way to the purple through intelligence and ambition, standing in the Hagia Sophia, that architectural miracle that his reign would create, and planning the reconquest of the West with the methodical determination of a man who had never learned to accept defeat. Justinian's wars of reconquest began in 533, when his general Belisarius sailed from Constantinople with an army of 30,000 men to destroy the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. It seemed an impossible task, crossing the sea to attack a barbarian kingdom that had held its territory for a century, that commanded fleets capable of raiding Italy and controlling the Western Mediterranean. But Belisarius was perhaps the last of the great Roman generals, a man who combined classical tactical knowledge with the flexibility needed to fight new kinds of enemies in new kinds of wars. The sound of the Vandal kingdom's collapse was sudden and shocking, like a great tree falling in a forest, its crash echoing across continents and startling everyone who had grown accustomed to its permanence. In 2 campaigns spanning barely a year, Belisarius shattered armies that had terrorized the Mediterranean for generations, captured Carthage and its treasure, and restored Roman rule to provinces that had been lost for a century. The conquest of Italy followed, though it proved more difficult and far more destructive than anyone had anticipated. The Ostrogothic kingdom that Theodoric the Great had built was no ramshackle barbarian confederation, but a sophisticated state that blended Germanic military efficiency with Roman administrative expertise. When Belisarius landed in Sicily in 535, he began a war that would last 20 years and leave the Italian peninsula depopulated and devastated, a shadow of its former prosperity. Picture the siege of Rome in 537, not the eternal city falling to barbarians this time, but Romans defending it against other Romans, Byzantine armies fighting Gothic defenders for possession of walls that both sides claimed as their rightful heritage. The irony was profound. In trying to restore the empire, Justinian was destroying what remained of Roman Italy, turning the peninsula into a battlefield where classical civilization itself was trampled under the feet of competing armies. Yet even as his armies struggled in the West, Justinian was creating at home a monument to Roman achievement that would outlast all his military conquests. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, was more than a church. It was a statement of imperial power, a demonstration that the Eastern Empire could still build wonders that would amaze the world. When Justinian first entered the completed cathedral, he supposedly whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." And perhaps he had. The great dome seemed to float above its supporting columns like heaven itself made visible, a miracle of engineering that proclaimed the empire's continued vitality to anyone who might doubt it. The Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's codification of Roman law, was another kind of monument, less visible than the Hagia Sophia, but ultimately more important. In organizing and systematizing the legal wisdom of 8 centuries, Justinian created a framework that would govern not just his own empire, but the developing legal systems of Western Europe for centuries to come. When medieval lawyers needed to understand concepts of justice and legal procedure, they turned to Justinian's code. When Renaissance scholars sought to revive classical learning, they found in his legal compilations a window into the Roman mind at its most systematic and thoughtful. But all of this came at a cost that the empire could barely afford. The wars of reconquest drained the treasury, devastated the provinces, and stretched the imperial armies to their breaking point. When plague struck the empire in 541, the first pandemic in recorded history, spreading from Egypt to Britain and killing perhaps a third of the Mediterranean's population, Justinian's resources were already strained beyond their limits. The emperor himself nearly died of the plague, and contemporary accounts describe him lying in his palace, his skin blackened and his breath shallow, while his wife Theodora, that remarkable woman who had risen from actress to empress, governed the empire from his bedside. When he finally recovered, he found a world transformed by suffering, where whole cities had been abandoned and entire provinces lay uncultivated because there were too few people left to work the land. The final campaigns in Italy dragged on through the 540s and 550s, each victory more Pyrrhic than the last. When Roman armies finally drove the last Gothic defenders from their strongholds in the Alps, they had won back provinces that were exhausted shells of their former selves. The Italy that Justinian restored to Roman rule bore little resemblance to the wealthy, populous peninsula that had once been the empire's heartland. In Spain, too, the reconquest began promisingly, but achieved only partial success. Byzantine armies carved out a foothold in the south, restoring Roman rule to cities that had been Visigothic for generations, but they could never extend their control beyond the coastal regions. The Spanish venture, like the Italian wars, proved that military victories were meaningless without the resources to consolidate and maintain them. When Justinian died in 565, he left behind an empire that was simultaneously glorious and exhausted, triumphant and bankrupt. His successors would spend generations trying to hold what he had reconquered, gradually losing ground to new enemies: Lombards in Italy, Avars in the Balkans, Persians in the east, and eventually Arabs who would sweep away whole provinces in campaigns that made Justinian's conquests seem like minor border adjustments. Yet the Eastern Empire survived, as it always had, by adapting to new realities while maintaining its essential character. The dream of universal restoration died with Justinian, but the dream of Roman continuity lived on, carried forward by emperors who ruled from Constantinople until 1453, when the last Caesar would die defending the walls of the last Roman city against Turkish cannons. In that long perspective, Justinian's reign was not an ending but a transformation, not the last gasp of the classical world, but the first breath of something new, a Christian empire that was thoroughly Roman and thoroughly medieval, thoroughly ancient and thoroughly modern, a bridge between the world that was dying and the world that was being born. In the ruins of Roman Gaul, where roads built by Caesar's engineers still carried merchants and pilgrims, but now served kingdoms that bore Germanic names, a new world was taking shape with the slow patience of seasons changing. The Frankish king Clovis stood in the Cathedral of Rheims on Christmas Day 496, as holy water touched his barbarian head and transformed him into something unprecedented. A Christian king ruling over Roman subjects, a Germanic warrior who had accepted not just the religion of the conquered, but their dreams of law and order, their vision of what civilization might be. Picture that moment, The tall Frank with his long yellow hair kneeling before a Roman bishop, while around him stood warriors who had learned to fight from horseback instead of on foot, who carried the long swords of their ancestors but also bore the title of Comes and Dux, Count and Duke, that marked them as inheritors of Roman administrative tradition. This was transformation, not destruction, adaptation, not conquest, the slow birth of something that was neither Roman nor barbarian, but somehow both. Listen to the sounds of this new Europe. Not the disciplined tramp of legions on stone roads, but the softer rhythm of Germanic warbands settling into Roman villas, learning to read Latin poetry by firelight, while their children played in courtyards that had once echoed with purely Roman voices. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain was producing legal codes that blended Germanic custom with Roman jurisprudence. The Ostrogothic court in Ravenna employed Roman senators alongside Gothic nobles. The Burgundian kingdom in the Rhone Valley was becoming famous for its scholarship, where monks copied manuscripts in scriptoriums that preserved both classical learning and barbarian epic poetry. The most remarkable transformation was happening in Gaul, where the Frankish kingdom was slowly absorbing the Gallo-Roman population through a process so gradual that no one quite noticed when barbarism ended and civilization began. Clovis and his successors were not destroyers, but inheritors, men who had learned to appreciate Roman law because it helped them govern more efficiently, Roman architecture because it impressed their subjects, Roman Christianity because it connected them to a wider world of learning and diplomacy. In the Villa Rustica that dotted the Frankish countryside, daily life continued much as it had under Roman rule. The same fields were ploughed by the same methods, the same grapes were harvested for the same wines, the same olive groves produced oil for lamps that burned with the same steady light they had cast for centuries. But now the lord of the villa might be a Frank named Chlodwig, rather than a Roman named Flavius, and his children would grow up speaking a language that blended Germanic vocabulary with Latin grammar in ways that would eventually become French. The Lombard kingdom in Italy represented another model of barbarian Roman fusion. When King Alboin led his people across the Alps in 568, he was not invading foreign territory, but claiming what his warriors believed was rightfully theirs, land that had been promised to them by earlier treaties, cities that had invited barbarian protection when Byzantine armies proved inadequate. The Lombard conquest was less a military campaign than a massive immigration, whole peoples moving south with their families and their cattle, their portable forges and their sacred groves, seeking not plunder but permanence. Picture the Lombard court at Pavia, where King Althari held audiences in a throne room decorated with Roman mosaics, while Germanic bards sang the ancient songs of their people in a language that borrowed Latin words for concepts that had no Germanic equivalents. Justice was administered according to Lombard law, but that law itself was being influenced by Roman legal traditions that the barbarians found useful for governing a sophisticated population. Trade continued along Roman roads, but now the merchants might be Lombards carrying amber from the Baltic to exchange for Byzantine silk. In Visigothic Spain, the process of cultural fusion was producing even more remarkable results. The kingdom centered on Toledo was becoming one of the most sophisticated states in post-Roman Europe, where Gothic nobles patronized scholars who translated Greek philosophy into Latin, where Roman engineering techniques were being used to build churches that blended Byzantine architectural elements with Germanic decorative traditions. The Visigothic legal code, compiled under King Receswinthe, was so sophisticated that it would influence Spanish law for centuries. But perhaps the most telling sign of transformation was happening in the hearts and minds of ordinary people, who were learning that identity was more complex and more fluid than anyone had previously imagined. A farmer in Gaul might be ethnically Roman, but legally Frankish. religiously Christian but culturally influenced by Germanic traditions. A craftsman in Italy might bear a Lombard name but practice Roman techniques, speak Latin at work, but Germanic dialects at home, attend a Christian church built on the foundations of a pagan temple. The old Roman distinction between civilized and barbarian was breaking down not because civilization was being destroyed, but because it was being redefined. Romanness was becoming less about ethnicity or place of birth, and more about participation in a shared culture of law and learning, trade and technology that transcended tribal boundaries. The barbarian kingdoms were Roman in all but name, preserving Roman institutions while adapting them to new circumstances, maintaining Roman ideals while expressing them through new forms. Christianity provided the binding force that made this cultural fusion possible. When barbarian kings converted to Orthodox Christianity, abandoning the Arianism that had initially separated them from their Roman subjects, they were accepting not just a theology, but a worldview that emphasized law and order, literacy and learning, the kind of sophisticated administration that made complex societies possible. The Church became the primary carrier of Roman culture, preserving classical learning in monastery libraries while adapting it to the needs of Germanic societies. The sound of 6th century Europe was the sound of synthesis, Latin hymns sung with Germanic inflections, Roman lore explained in barbarian languages, classical poetry memorized by warriors who could neither read nor write, but who appreciated the rhythm and dignity of words that connected them to something larger than their own tribal traditions. This was not the collapse of civilization, but its transformation, not the victory of barbarism over culture, but the creation of something new that honored both traditions. In the monasteries that were beginning to dot the European landscape, monks who might be ethnically Roman or Germanic worked side by side, copying manuscripts that preserved everything from Virgil's poetry to Germanic law codes, from theological treatises to agricultural manuals. The monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict of Nursia around 529, became a model for institutions that would preserve learning through the darkest centuries ahead, while also providing practical education in agriculture, crafts, and administration. The cities too were adapting to new realities. Paris, under the Merovingian kings, was smaller than it had been under Roman rule, but it was also more diverse, more creative, more open to new influences. Gothic refugees from Justinian's wars mingled with Frankish settlers and Gallo-Roman natives in markets, where Byzantine gold bought Germanic amber, where Spanish leather was traded for English wool, where ideas traveled as freely as goods along trade routes that connected the barbarian kingdoms to a wider world of commerce and culture. As the 6th century drew to a close, Europe was beginning to look like what it would become. Not a restored Roman Empire, but a constellation of kingdoms that preserved Roman achievements while developing new forms of government, new styles of art, new ways of understanding the relationship between ruler and ruled, between earth and heaven, between the classical past and the Christian future. The barbarian kingdoms had become the inheritors of Rome, but they were also something more. The creators of medieval Europe, the bridge between the ancient world and the modern one, the proof that civilization could survive the fall of empires by learning to wear new clothes while keeping its essential spirit intact. In the soft light of dawn breaking over the hills of Ireland, where Roman legions had never marched but Roman ideas had found wings, a young monk named Columba prepared for a journey that would carry Christianity to places the empire had never imagined. The year was 563, and across the Celtic Sea lay Scotland, where Pictish kings still ruled from hilltop fortresses, and druids still whispered the old wisdom to oak trees that remembered when the world was young. But the faith that had begun in a carpenter's shop in Nazareth was learning to speak new languages, to honor new saints, to find the divine in landscapes that had never known Mediterranean sunshine. This was Christianity's great transformation, the centuries when the faith ceased to be a Roman religion and became something universal, something that could take root in Germanic forests and Celtic islands, in the courts of barbarian kings and the huts of Anglo-Saxon farmers. The church that had once met in secret in Roman catacombs was learning to build stone cathedrals that could weather northern storms, to celebrate liturgies that honored local traditions while maintaining universal truths, to speak of salvation in languages that had never heard Latin conjugations. Listen to the sound of this changing faith, not just the Gregorian chant that echoed through Roman basilicas, but the Celtic hymns that rose from Irish monasteries like mist from morning lakes, not just the theological debates of Constantinople's learned bishops, but the simple prayers of English peasants kneeling in churches built from the stones of Roman ruins. Christianity was becoming indigenous, putting down roots in soils that had never been Roman, flowering in climates that Mediterranean Christianity had never imagined. The Irish Church was perhaps the most remarkable example of this transformation. Cut off from Rome by the collapse of imperial authority in Britain, Irish Christians had developed their own traditions, their own forms of monasticism, their own ways of understanding the relationship between the natural world and the divine. In monasteries scattered across the Irish countryside, monks who had never seen a Roman city preserved classical learning while creating illuminated manuscripts that blended Christian symbolism with Celtic artistic traditions that stretched back to pre-Roman antiquity. Picture the monastery of Clonmacnoise, founded by St. Ciaran in 548 on the banks of the Shannon, where monks worked in scriptoriums that overlooked wetlands where herons stood like contemplative spirits, and the wind carried the scent of peat smoke from distant cottages. Here they copied not just the Gospels and the works of church fathers, but also classical texts, Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Horace, preserving the literature of Rome while developing new forms of Christian expression that would influence European culture for centuries. The Irish missionaries who spread across Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries carried with them this unique blend of Roman learning and Celtic spirituality. Columba's mission to Scotland established monasteries that became centers of learning and culture. Columbanus traveled to Gaul and Italy, founding monasteries that challenged both secular rulers and church hierarchies with their uncompromising dedication to ascetic ideals. These Irish monks were not trying to restore Roman Christianity, but to create something new, something that could speak to barbarian hearts while maintaining the intellectual rigor that had characterized the faith's early centuries. In Anglo-Saxon England, Christianity faced an even greater challenge: how to convert peoples who had no memory of Roman rule, no familiarity with Mediterranean culture, no previous exposure to monotheistic religion. When Augustine of Canterbury landed in Kent in 597, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the English, he found kingdoms that were entirely pagan, where kings still sacrificed to Woden and Thor, where bards still sang the old heroic lays in mead halls lit by fire, and decorated with weapons taken from conquered enemies. The Synod of Whitby in 1664 was more than a debate about the proper date for Easter. It was a moment when English Christianity chose between the Irish tradition that had grown up in isolation and the Roman tradition that connected them to the wider Catholic world. When King Oswiu of Northumbria decided in favor of Roman practice, he was choosing not just a liturgical calendar, but a vision of Christianity that looked south toward Rome rather than west toward Ireland, that emphasized unity and orthodoxy rather than local adaptation and mystical experience. Yet even as English Christianity aligned itself with Rome, it retained distinctive characteristics that reflected its barbarian origins. The poem known as The Dream of the Rood, which reimagined the crucifixion in terms familiar to Germanic warriors, showed how Christian themes could be expressed through indigenous poetic traditions. Churches built in the Anglo-Saxon period blended Roman architectural elements with Germanic decorative styles, creating a distinctive religious art that was neither purely Roman nor purely barbarian, but something entirely new. The transformation was happening across Europe. In Frankish Gaul, Christianity was adapting to Germanic legal traditions that emphasized compensation rather than punishment, kinship rather than citizenship, personal loyalty rather than abstract justice. Frankish law codes tried to reconcile Christian ideals of mercy and forgiveness with Germanic customs that demanded blood payment for injuries and honor satisfaction for insults. The result was a legal system that was neither purely Christian nor purely Germanic, but something that drew from both traditions while satisfying the practical needs of a diverse population. In Lombard Italy, the process was even more complex. The Lombards had initially been Arian Christians, followers of a theology that Orthodox Christianity had declared heretical. Their conversion to orthodoxy was gradual and incomplete, producing a Christianity that retained traces of Arian influence while slowly conforming to Roman Catholic doctrine. Lombard churches built in this period often featured architectural elements that reflected both Orthodox and Arian influences, creating a distinctive style that expressed the theological tensions of a people caught between competing versions of Christian truth. The monastic movement provided much of the energy for this transformation. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written around 530, offered a model of monastic life that was strict enough to maintain spiritual discipline, but flexible enough to adapt to local conditions. Benedictine monasteries became centers not just of prayer and contemplation, but of practical education, teaching barbarian converts the skills they needed to participate in a Christian civilization: literacy and numeracy, agriculture and crafts, law and administration. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in the Christian understanding of culture itself. The early church had often seen pagan culture as something to be rejected, the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans as dangerous temptation that could lead believers away from divine truth. The church fathers of the barbarian age were developing a more nuanced approach, one that distinguished between pagan religion, which must be rejected, and pagan culture, which could be baptized and transformed for Christian purposes. This principle of cultural adaptation allowed Christianity to absorb elements from Germanic and Celtic traditions without compromising its essential message. Pagan festivals became Christian holy days, but their timing and many of their customs were preserved. Pagan sacred sites became locations for Christian churches, but their natural sanctity was honored and reinterpreted in Christian terms. Pagan heroic ideals were transformed into Christian virtues, but their emphasis on courage, loyalty, and honor remained intact. The sound of Christianity in the barbarian age was the sound of synthesis. Latin prayers spoken with Germanic accents, Celtic melodies carrying Christian lyrics, Roman legal concepts explained in barbarian languages. This was not the corruption of pure Christianity by pagan influences, but the maturation of a faith that was learning to speak all languages, to honor all cultures, to find the divine presence in every human tradition that could be reconciled with the gospel message. When Pope Gregory the Great advised Augustine of Canterbury to adapt pagan temples for Christian worship, rather than destroying them, he was articulating a principle that would guide the Church's approach to culture for centuries: the belief that God could work through any human institution that was oriented toward truth and justice, that Christian faith was strong enough to transform pagan traditions without being corrupted by them, that the Church's mission was not to replace human culture. but to perfect it. This was the Christianity that would shape medieval Europe, confident enough to embrace classical learning, flexible enough to adapt to local customs, universal enough to unite diverse peoples under a single spiritual authority. It was a faith that had learned to see the hand of God in Germanic law codes and Celtic poetry, in Anglo-Saxon epic and Frankish chronicles, in all the diverse expressions of human creativity that sought to understand the relationship between earth and heaven, between human justice and divine mercy, between the world that was passing away and the world that was being born. On Christmas morning in the year 800, in the Basilica of St. Peter, where ancient martyrs slept beneath marble stones, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet, something extraordinary happened that would have seemed impossible to the barbarian warriors who had first crossed the Rhine 3 centuries earlier. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, a giant of a man whose ancestors had worshipped Thor and Wotan in the dark forests of Germany, knelt before the altar as Pope Leo III placed upon his head a crown that proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Listen to that moment, the rustle of silk vestments in the winter air, the whispered Latin prayers echoing off vaulted ceilings, the collective intake of breath from nobles who understood they were witnessing not just a coronation, but a resurrection. Rome had not died after all. It had simply been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake in new clothes, speaking new languages, carrying forward its ancient dreams through bloodlines that traced back to barbarian camps and Christian monasteries rather than patrician villas and senatorial families. But this was not the Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius rising from its grave. This was something unprecedented, a Holy Roman Empire that was neither holy nor Roman, nor quite an empire in any classical sense, but rather a magnificent hybrid that blended Germanic kingship with Roman imperial ideology, Christian theology with classical learning, barbarian energy with Mediterranean sophistication. It was Rome reimagined, Rome reborn, Rome transformed into something that would have surprised its founders, but perhaps would not have displeased them. Picture Charlemagne's court at Aachen, where the great king built his palace in conscious imitation of the Byzantine emperors, surrounding himself with scholars who could read Greek and theologians who debated the nature of divine grace, administrators who governed according to principles derived from Roman law, and artists who decorated his chapels with mosaics that would not have looked out of place in Justinian's Constantinople. This was barbarian kingship that had learned to appreciate civilization, Germanic culture that had been baptized not just in Christianity, but in the classical tradition that Christianity had preserved and transmitted. The scholars who gathered around Charlemagne, men like Alcuin of York and Einhard the Frank, were not trying to restore the Roman Empire in any literal sense. They were creating something new, a Christian civilization that honored the Roman past while adapting it to the needs of peoples who had never been Roman subjects, who had their own traditions of law and governance, their own languages and customs, their own ways of understanding the relationship between ruler and ruled. The Carolingian Renaissance was perhaps the most remarkable cultural achievement of the early Middle Ages, a deliberate effort to revive classical learning not as antiquarian curiosity, but as living tradition that could guide the governance of Christian kingdoms. In the scriptoriums of monasteries scattered across Charlemagne's empire, monks copied not just the Bible and the works of church fathers, but also Virgil and Cicero, mathematical treatises and astronomical texts, medical manuals and agricultural guides, everything that comprised the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. But even as they copied these texts, the scribes were transforming them. The Latin they wrote was no longer the classical Latin of Cicero's orations, but a new form of the language, influenced by Germanic grammar and Celtic vocabulary, adapted to express concepts that the ancient world had never imagined. The manuscripts they produced were illuminated with artistic motifs that blended classical elements with barbarian decorative traditions, creating a distinctive visual style that was neither Roman nor Germanic, but something entirely new. Listen to the sounds of this new Europe. Church bells marking the canonical hours, where once Roman water clocks had measured time. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on roads that were still Roman, but now carried Frankish merchants and Saxon pilgrims. The scratch of quills on parchment in scriptoriums, where Irish monks copied Greek texts for German students. The chanting of Latin hymns in accents that would have puzzled Augustine, but would not have surprised him, for he had always known that the gospel was meant for all nations, all tongues, all peoples. The empire that emerged from Charlemagne's conquests was vast but unstable, held together more by personal loyalty to the emperor than by institutional structures that could survive his death. When he died in 814, his empire began the process of fragmentation that would eventually produce the medieval kingdoms of France and Germany, Italy and Hungary, each claiming to be the heir of Rome while developing its own distinctive culture and institutions. Yet something profound had been established. The idea that civilization was not the monopoly of any single people or culture, but a human achievement that could be shared, transmitted, and transformed by anyone willing to undertake the discipline of learning. The barbarian kingdoms had not destroyed Roman civilization. They had inherited it, adapted it, and made it their own. In doing so, they had created something that was in many ways superior to what they had inherited, a civilization that was more inclusive, more flexible, more capable of growth and adaptation than the rigid imperial system it replaced. The Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries provided an interesting counterpoint to this Christian transformation of the Roman legacy. When Arab armies conquered Syria and Egypt, Spain and Sicily, they too became inheritors of classical learning, preserving and transmitting Greek philosophy and Roman law, Persian science, and Indian mathematics. The Islamic world became another vessel for the preservation of ancient wisdom, creating libraries in Baghdad and Cordoba, where Christian and Jewish scholars worked alongside Muslim intellectuals to translate and comment upon the texts that comprised humanity's intellectual inheritance. The dialogue between Christian and Islamic civilization, often conducted through warfare but also through trade and scholarship, created a creative tension that enriched both traditions. When Charlemagne's scholars needed copies of Aristotle's works, they often turned to Islamic libraries. When Islamic mathematicians sought to understand Ptolemaic astronomy, they consulted Christian translations. The ancient world lived on not in any single tradition, but in the creative interaction between traditions that had all learned to honor the past while adapting it to new circumstances. In the monasteries and cathedral schools of Western Europe, a new form of education was developing that would eventually produce the medieval universities. Students who might be sons of Germanic warriors or Celtic chieftains learned to read Latin poetry and debate theological questions, to calculate the date of Easter and copy manuscript illuminations, to understand Roman law and practice Gregorian chant. They were becoming something that the ancient world had never quite imagined: scholar warriors, priest administrators, barbarian intellectuals who could fight with swords when necessary, but preferred to fight with words and ideas. The memory of Rome lived on in countless small ways, in the legal codes that governed barbarian kingdoms, in the architectural styles that influenced church building, in the Latin language that remained the tongue of learning and administration, in the imperial dreams that continued to inspire kings and emperors long after the last Caesar had fallen. But it lived on transformed, adapted, made new by peoples who had never known the Pax Romana, but who had learned to appreciate the Roman vision of law and order, justice and civilization. As the 8th century drew to a close and Europe stood on the threshold of the High Middle Ages, the transformation was complete. The barbarian kingdoms had become Christian civilizations. Germanic law had been baptized by Roman jurisprudence. Celtic artistry had been enriched by classical models. The Church had become the primary carrier of ancient learning, while also being the creator of new forms of spirituality and intellectual inquiry. Rome had fallen, but Romanness had survived, not as a political system or an ethnic identity, but as a way of thinking about human society, a vision of what civilization might be when law and learning, art and religion, practical governance and transcendent aspiration were brought together in creative synthesis. The barbarians had inherited the earth, but in inheriting it, they had also inherited the responsibility to preserve and transmit everything that was best in human culture. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, you could almost hear the ancient ghosts stirring in their marble tombs, not in anger at what had been lost, but in wonder at what had been preserved and transformed. The empire they had built with sword and law had given way to something they could never have imagined. A civilization held together, not by force of arms, but by shared faith and learning, not by the fear of punishment, but by the hope of salvation, not by the authority of Caesar, but by the love of Christ. This was Rome's final victory, not the conquest of barbarians by Romans, but the conquest of barbarism by civilization, accomplished not through the destruction of tribal cultures, but through their elevation and transformation. The fall of Rome had become the rise of Europe, and in that rise the ancient dream of universal peace and justice lived on, carried forward by peoples who had learned that the highest form of conquest was not the subjugation of enemies, but their conversion into allies. Not the destruction of other cultures, but their incorporation into a larger vision of human possibility. The memory of Rome would continue to inspire and challenge human societies for centuries to come, not as a model to be copied, but as a vision to be fulfilled. The vision of a world where diverse peoples could live together under just laws, where learning and faith could flourish side by side, where the best achievements of the past could be preserved, while new forms of beauty and wisdom were created for the future. It was a dream worth sleeping on, a story worth remembering, a legacy worth inheriting by all who came after. And so our journey through the twilight of empires comes to its close. As you drift toward sleep, let these images settle in your mind like autumn leaves finding their rest. The sound of Latin prayers in Germanic accents, the sight of barbarian kings reading Roman poetry by candlelight, the touch of old stones still warm with the memory of vanished glories. Rome fell, but its spirit soared on wings that carry it still through the dreams of all who seek to build something beautiful and lasting in this world. Sleep well, and let the echoes of history whisper their ancient wisdom into your dreams.